Hi, I'm Hannah Brents. I am a licensed independent clinical social worker and a registered yoga instructor with a private practice in Massachusetts. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in religious studies, and I have seen firsthand how toxic and fundamentalist religious communities can be very damaging. So, thanks for being here. Before we jump into today, remember to subscribe to the Theology Therapist channel and press the little bell so you can get notifications on all new releases. If you find any of this helpful, I would love if you would leave a comment and share with a friend. Now let's get started. So today, it's the beginning of the year, it's around the beginning of the year, and this is usually the time that people make resolutions for better or for worse, and that people tend to think about starting therapy. It's also, the dead of winter. And so in most places, it is dark for most of the day. It is cold. So by and large, the weather or the season can really impact how we are feeling. So you may be wondering, how do you know when it's time to go to therapy? So I want to talk to you about that today. How do you know? So I'm going to give you four signs that it might be time for therapy. And then we are going to talk about the pros and the cons, okay? So the four signs, we're gonna start with sign number one, is if you are suicidal or you are thinking about or engaging in any self-harm. So this is the number one sign. If any of these two things are happening, seek help immediately. It is time to start therapy, and it's time to get a team of support around you, because really that is the best way to get help. It's with a team. It's not one person most often. It's with a group of people, because really well-being takes a village. The second sign is if your symptoms are disrupting your ability to function on a daily basis. So what does that mean? That would mean like your ability to function at work, at school, socializing, with family. If you are having a hard time at work concentrating, if you are having trouble creating and maintaining relationships, if you find yourself canceling social plans, or like if you're having unexplained physical symptoms. If you're having unexplained physical symptoms, always seek medical help. But they might direct you back to mental health. I hear that all the time, all the time. Common thing, like feeling like you're going to have a heart attack, or thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm having a heart attack. You're having chest pain, shortness of breath, like all of these kind of physical symptoms of maybe numbness, tingling, like all these symptoms of heart attack. And then you go to the doctor or to the hospital because you're panicked. You're like, I'm 30 and I'm having a heart attack. And they say, there's nothing wrong with your heart. And you're like, are you gaslighting me right now? No. So if you're having unexplained physical symptoms, always seek medical treatment, but you might find they might send you back for mental health treatment. And it's not always around, like the anxiety, like the heart attack. That's a really common one, but you find this a lot in trauma, or even like migraines happen. So you find this also in a lot of other presentations, but heart attack is just an easy example. All right, so third sign that therapy would be a great choice, or it is the right time to start therapy, is if you identify areas in your life that are growth areas. So a lot of times we think about therapy as a crisis resource. Why would I go to therapy? Because I'm not like in crisis, I'm okay, I'm kind of getting by, all of these things. And I would love to scream from the mountaintop that therapy is not only a crisis resource, okay? Tell all your friends, it's not a crisis resource. Therapy can be extremely helpful when you are outside of crisis, because when you are in crisis, of course it's helpful, but you're just putting out fires, right? You're just putting out fires wherever they're popping up. And really, when you're beginning therapy there, the whole first part of therapy is is not really about growth at all. It's about clearing away all the brush. It's about like making daily life livable, really. And so a great time to start therapy is if you can identify areas in your life where you want to see growth. So that might be improving your adult friendships. This is a big one, okay? Even I've talked about this for myself personally, as living as an expat a lot of times in my adult life, or simply moving to a new place. Making friendships as an adult is extremely difficult. The other thing about friendships is that you might have friends who point out patterns in you that are negatively impacting your friendships. So I don't know, maybe your friends say you're flaky or whatever, I don't know. So maybe you say you would like to improve your friendships. You have heard, you're like following all the therapists on Instagram, or your therapist has talked to you about this. We've heard about attachment styles, and you would like to move to a secure attachment style. If you're like, what am I talking about? That's a whole nother conversation that we can have, but we are not having today. So if you want to develop a secure attachment style and move from an insecure attachment style, that is a great time to go to therapy. If you would like to process trauma, that's what we talk about here, right? Like that is the majority of what we spend our time talking about here. If you want to process trauma, it's the time to go to therapy. If you want to relieve anxiety, therapy is a great option. It can teach a lot of coping tools. It can help you figure out what are some core beliefs that may be impacting your lived experience. A lot of things. So those are just some examples. They are not an exhaustive list. But if you can identify some growth areas, that is point number 3 or sign number 3, that is a good time to go to therapy. The 4th sign is if others around you say that you should go to therapy. So this goes without saying, you might not see the writing on the wall, but it seems like everybody else does. I put this as a sign because if everybody else is saying that you should go to therapy, it might be a good indicator that there are some, that you might not be functioning well, that you might be having these negative thoughts about yourself we talked about initially, or that you might have some growth areas. And this might be the hardest time to go to therapy, because if you're not, you have to be on board. You have to be on board to go to therapy. And if you're going because everybody says you should go, but you don't want to be there, then it's not going to be effective. So if you are going because everybody else, like maybe your partner says that you should go to therapy, or your kids say that you should go to therapy, if everybody else around you says you should go to therapy and you desire to figure out why that is, if you have that openness, then that's a great time to go to therapy. If you feel defensive, it's normal to feel some level of defensiveness, but if you feel like a strong defensiveness around this and are opposed, like you're actively opposed, you're like this, they are wrong, it's not going to be helpful. So, but if you have that openness, then it is a great time to go to therapy. So those are your 4 signs about when to start therapy. I am going to now talk to you about the cons. I'm going to start with the cons and then move to the pros. So the first con of therapy, we can call it a con. We can use other language like cost benefit. So this is one of the costs of therapy is the cost itself. And so I just want to give you a short conversation here about cost because it is a financial commitment. And I think research shows, today I don't have the article to back this up, so I'm just gonna kind of making this one up sort of now, so go fact check me. But I do think research shows that if you pay $0 for something, you are less invested in it, or like less appreciative, or whatever the thing is, than if you actually paid like money for it. So therapy is a financial commitment. It's a commitment in a lot of ways as well, but financial commitment can be prohibitive. So I want to talk to you about 2 things first. So I want to talk to you about in-network versus out-of-network providers. You might be like, what the heck are you talking about? In the US, insurance or in the healthcare system works on a managed care system. And that just means that we have private insurance. You get insurance through a private company or through a private system. I'm not going to do like a whole historical analysis of that right now and why that is and the pros and the cons. It's just like, that's what is. And so for our conversation today, for the cost, what you need to know is your insurance benefits. You've got to know that. If you're going to seek therapy, you have to know what your insurance benefits are. Do you know if you have a PPO or an HMO? This is like the two biggest things. So PPOs, they have an allowance for out-of-network providers. HMOs tend to not. Do you have a deductible, right? What is your deductible, right? Is it that you have a $5,000 yearly deductible and then after that they're going to cover 80%? Well, you're going to have to weigh that, right? But this is really important to know when you are seeking therapy or when you're seeking services for anything medical services. Because, like for example, say you have to routinely get an MRI because of something. Like you have to annually get an MRI or annually get a colonoscopy or whatever it is. That service might have you meet that $5,000 deductible. And so for therapy, right? For therapy, you might actually be only needing to pay 20% of whatever the fee is, the full private fee. So if you only have to pay 20% because you already have a big medical expense that you know happens, and this is great news, because this means essentially that you can go find a provider that you fit with, that specializes in what you need and that has availability, and being able to access those services at their fee without having to bear the majority of the financial burden. So if you absolutely must go with a provider who is in network with your insurance, then you are likely going to have a lot more legwork up front. Most of these providers have huge wait lists and in reality will likely be a generalist rather than a specialist. Given this, you will have to contact a whole lot more people to get a response back, and who you hear from might not be your top choice. But you may choose to go with them instead of going through that whole arduous process again. Going with a out-of-network provider opens up a lot of possibilities for you in terms of choosing someone who you trust, connect with, and who specializes in exactly what you need. It will mean, though, that you will likely have to do some legwork throughout the time that you are engaged in services with them in their practice in order to submit receipts to your insurance so that you can get that partial reimbursement that I talked about a second ago. Okay, so that was about cost. The second con is time and effort. You're going to have to decide if you're going to do virtual or in person. There is going to be a commuting time if you're doing in-person. Sessions tend to last 45 minutes, and they are generally during normal business hours. So you might be able to find a therapist who has evening hours. Sometimes you can find one with weekend hours, although that's, I would say, pretty rare now. My hours are in the morning, so I have like a 6 a.m. to noon schedule, and so I see people before they go to work. The bulk, though, of the times for therapy are going to be during normal business hours, which means that there's going to have to be probably some negotiation that you'll need to think about, whether that's on your day off, whether that's getting an hour sneaking away from work, things like that. So the time and effort piece, there's also this requirement, sort of, if you will, if you think about it like that, to think about the session or the homework or the kind of what you are talking about in between sessions. That's not to say that every provider is going to give you homework to then turn in. No. Probably more often than not, they will not. But you have to make a commitment to the experience in order to see any benefit from it. There are, my favorite way to think about this is there are, I think, 167 hours in a week, 166, but I think 167 hours in a week. And if you practice only during therapy, the like new skills or ways of thinking or whatever, like if you only do those things in 1 hour during therapy, that's 1 hour out of, and the rest of the time, the 166 other hours, you're doing something different or that kind of status quo, it's going to take a whole lot longer to see any change. The other time and effort piece is delayed gratification. I was just talking about the putting in the time and effort in between sessions, but the other side of that is that therapy is an act of delayed gratification. Yes, many people feel better soon after starting therapy simply from reaching out for help. But generally, the sustained change comes after a period of dedication to the experience. So practice, practice, practice. I would say the third cost or the third con right now is stigma. There are a whole bunch of different kinds of ways in which going to therapy is stigmatized. It is starting to change, thankfully, but I am just going to give 3 here. So the first stigma of going to therapy is that you're broken, right? If you think about religious messaging, that if you are going to therapy, right, it's sort of saying, accepting that something is wrong, something is not as it should be, something, it's sort of etc. And that because a lot of times in religious environments, the suggestion that's going to be given to you is to pray. It might be seen as like the brokenness comes in from not doing that good enough, right? So there's a sort of hiding that happens. Like we don't talk about this with outsiders in these kind of toxic religious communities. The other way mental health is stigmatized is by being seen as crazy. This is often in cultural or societal messaging. Someone might say, well, I'm not crazy enough to go to therapy. That one feels like, maybe because I'm a therapist, but that one feels like, do I even need to talk about this? Because what? But no, going to therapy does not mean you are crazy. And also, if we're talking about stigma here, the idea that therapy is only for someone who is crazy is only playing into that cycle of stigma for someone who you might typically call crazy. Does that make sense? Like that's only furthering that stigma for that person. So let's not do that. The last one is negative assumptions. Just simply that people are going to think poorly about me. If I go and that they are going to think that X, Y, or Z in whatever way poorly about me because I don't have friends to talk to. I need to pay somebody to talk to or whatever. But now moving on to the pros. So one of the benefits of therapy is the investment, right? The investment into present and future you. The return on investment, like we talked about with that delayed gratification, those coping skills, improvement in growth areas that you want to see. One of the cons of therapy is the investment, but really it's also one of the benefits. I would say probably one of the biggest benefits. Another pro of therapy is that you have this neutral party. A neutral party makes it easier to assess negative patterns that are no longer serving you. You get this outsider's view. A neutral party also allows for confidentiality. So unless you are a serious threat to yourself or someone else, your therapist is not going to talk to anyone else about what you've shared. Another pro is boundaries. The B word, boundaries. These are or should be clearly laid out with a therapist from the very beginning. Time, communication, expectations, late cancellation fees, etc. Right? Like that, those should all be in the informed consent that you get. That was the new year this recently, and so I just sent out my sort of annual informed consent, which has all of this in there. And that's the expectation, right? That says in social media, right, that I cannot ethically follow you back, right? So from the very, very beginning, there is an expectation set of what the boundary is. Therapy is also the model of appropriate boundaries. We were talking back to attachment styles. Boundaries are oftentimes inherent in secure attachments. They make a lot of sense, they whatever. And boundaries, though, with people that we love can be really hard to keep and maintain. And so therapy is a model for good boundaries and the place to also practice boundaries. The other thing about boundaries is that there is safety in boundaries, which is extremely important in trauma work. You can always leave, right? Like with trauma work or religious trauma, those cult environments where you were made to believe, or even in your family, that you had to stay, like you can't leave. In therapy, that isn't the case. The boundaries are set from the beginning and there is safety in that, and you can. The other thing about boundaries is that one thing that it has the opportunity to provide that we don't often get outside in our lives is beginnings and endings. We get to a therapy, experience how relationships begin and end in a safe and healthy way by engaging in what in clinical language is called a termination session. This is for ending. Don't be scared. Don't be scared to talk to your therapist about discontinuing therapy if you guys have a good relationship. You can make a plan together of resources, of available coping skills, or supports that you can use to acclimate to the idea of not having therapy. The idea, like you might notice that it's getting to the point when it's probably time to move on, or you would do well on your own or whatever. But when you have that conversation with your therapist, it can be a really powerful one, a really fulfilling one, to get to have that closure that we don't often have in our daily lives. So, big old talk today about how to know if you should start therapy and the pros and cons or the costs and the benefits of therapy. If you are thinking about starting therapy, but you are worried that you will be stuck in it forever, this is extremely unlikely. Most often you don't stay with a therapist in like an ongoing ending forever basis, because just that's not how life or relationships work. And so if you've been thinking about it, I encourage you to reach out to a local therapist today. If you're in Massachusetts, you are welcome to schedule a consult in my private practice. Be well, and I'll see you next week.